When I discovered my husband's years-long gay relationship, I refused to be their cover story and chose to end both the pregnancy and marriage. I'm 29 now, grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and I've always dreamed of the whole white picket fence life. You know, marriage, kids, the works. So when I met Nate, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. Nate and I had been dating for about 2 years when he proposed. He was sweet, charming, and honestly, the kind of guy my parents adored. He had this quiet confidence about him, like he always had a plan. And when he got down on one knee during a summer picnic by the lake, I didn't even hesitate. I said yes, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was living my own happily ever after. Fast forward to the wedding day. It was a small but beautiful ceremony. All twinkle lights, soft music, and way too many mason jars. Everything was perfect. Well, almost everything. At one point during the reception, I noticed Nate in the corner of the room, talking to his old college friend, Dylan. I'd met Dylan a few times before, and he seemed nice enough, kind of the life of the party type, always cracking jokes and turning everything into a story. But something about the way they were standing felt off. I don't know how to explain it exactly. They were standing really close, and Nate had this weird smile on his face, like he was nervous or something. I brushed it off at the time. I mean, it was his wedding day, right? Maybe he was just overwhelmed. Plus, Dylan left early, and I figured it was nothing. The honeymoon was great, sort of. I mean, it was Hawaii, so how bad could it be? But looking back, there were little things that didn't sit right. Nate seemed distant. Like, we'd be lying on the beach, and he'd be scrolling through his phone instead of talking to me. And when I tried to be affectionate, you know, holding hands, cuddling, that kind of stuff, he always had some excuse. I'm tired. I've got a headache. I think I had too much sun today. I told myself it was just the stress of the wedding catching up to him. I was so good at rationalizing everything back then. Then came the first year of marriage, and things got even stranger. I won't go into all the details, but let's just say Nate's aversion to intimacy didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. He'd come home late from work, claiming he had deadlines or last-minute meetings. And when he was home, he was either glued to his laptop or zoning out in front of the TV. I started to feel like a roommate instead of a wife. But every time I tried to bring it up, he'd just brush me off. "You're overthinking it," he'd say. Or worse, he'd make me feel guilty for even asking. "Do you think I don't love you or something?" And of course, I'd immediately backpedal. No, of course not," I'd say, even though deep down, I was starting to wonder. The breaking point came about a year into our marriage when I found out I was pregnant. Total surprise, by the way. We hadn't even been trying, which, considering how little intimacy there was, should have been my first clue something was off. When I told Nate, I expected him to be shocked, sure, but happy. Instead, he just froze, like completely stone-faced. Then he muttered something like, "Wow, okay," and walked out of the room. For the next few weeks, he avoided me even more than usual. No hugs, no kisses, not even a hand on my shoulder. It was like I'd done something wrong by getting pregnant. And that's when I really started to feel like something wasn't adding up. Things didn't get any better after the pregnancy news. If anything, it got worse. Nate was practically a ghost in the house. I'd catch him staring at his phone a lot, like he was waiting for a message or something, and whenever I walked into the room, he'd put it face down on the table. I started feeling like I was going crazy. I mean, I was pregnant with his child, and he couldn't even be bothered to ask me how I was feeling most days. I'd sit there Googling, "Why is my husband distant during pregnancy?" and telling myself it must be stress. Maybe he was freaking out about becoming a dad or something. People react to big changes differently, right? That's what I told myself. But then there were the little things I couldn't explain away. Like he started taking these work trips out of nowhere. He'd never mentioned them before, and they always seemed to pop up at the last minute. When I asked why he hadn't told me earlier, he'd say something like, "Oh, it's just a quick thing. No big deal." I didn't want to seem like the paranoid wife. I mean, I trusted him, at least I thought I did, so I let it go. But it was starting to add up. The late nights, the phone flipping, the sudden work trips. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, I decided to bring it up. We were sitting on the couch, watching some random Netflix show, and I just turned to him and said, "Nate, is everything okay with us? You've been so distant lately." He barely looked at me. "Yeah, everything's fine." "Why wouldn't it be?" he said, in that dismissive tone that made me feel like I was being ridiculous for even asking. "It's just, I don't know. You've been acting different. I pressed. He sighed, paused the show, and gave me this tired look. I'm stressed, okay? Work's been crazy, and now with the baby, it's a lot. I wanted to believe him. I really did. So I told myself to drop it. Maybe I was just being hormonal or overthinking things. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. Then one night, everything came to a head. Nate was in the shower, and his phone started buzzing on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but it kept buzzing, like, nonstop. I glanced at the screen, and I saw Dylan's name pop up. You remember Dylan, right? The college friend from the wedding. I hadn't thought about him much since then, but seeing his name now felt weird, and the messages just kept coming. I could see part of the preview text on the lock screen, and it wasn't exactly casual. Stuff like, I can't stop thinking about last weekend, and when can I see you again? My heart just sank. I don't even know how to describe that feeling. It was like my entire body went cold. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help myself. I picked up the phone and unlocked it. Yeah, I knew his passcode, don't judge me. And there it was. Dozens of messages between Nate and Dylan. Some of them were explicit, like way more than I wanted to see. But it wasn't just the physical stuff. They were talking about feelings, about how much they missed each other, about how hard it was to keep sneaking around. And then there was one message that hit me like a truck. I hate lying to her, but what choice do I have? I felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped the phone. I don't even know how long I stood there, staring at the screen, before I heard the shower turn off. Panic set in. I put the phone back exactly where I found it and practically bolted out of the bedroom. I ended up sitting in the kitchen, just staring at the table, trying to process what I'd seen. My mind was racing. Who was this person I married? Had he been lying to me this whole time? And what the hell was I supposed to do now? Later that night, when Nate came downstairs, I tried to act normal. I don't know how I managed it, but I did. I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. But one thing was clear. My marriage wasn't what I thought it was. And I wasn't sure it ever had been. It took me a few days to work up the nerve to confront Nate. I spent those days in this weird fog, going through the motions but constantly replaying those messages in my head. But I needed a plan. I needed answers. So I decided I wasn't going to tiptoe around it anymore. I was done playing the clueless, understanding wife. It happened on a Saturday morning. Nate was sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through his phone like usual. I walked in and stood there for a second, just watching him. He looked so normal, like nothing was wrong, like he hadn't completely shattered my trust. Nate, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked up, startled, and I could tell from his face that he knew something was up. We need to talk. He set his phone down and gave me this cautious look. Okay, what's going on? I sat down across from him, took a deep breath, and just said it. I know about you and Dylan. For a second, he didn't move. He just stared at me like he was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. Then he blinked and looked away, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was shaky. Don't, I snapped. Don't insult me by pretending. I saw the messages. That's when he froze. His hand stopped mid-reach, and his whole body seemed to deflate. He leaned back in his chair and buried his face in his hands. Oh my God, he muttered. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was suffocating. Then, finally, he looked up at me, and I could see tears in his eyes. I didn't want you to find out like this, he said softly. Find out what, Nate? I shot back. That you've been lying to me? That our entire marriage is a joke. He flinched at that, but he didn't argue. Instead, he just broke down. I mean, full-on sobbing. It was so surreal. I'd never seen him like that before, and honestly, it just made me angrier. Like, you don't get to cry right now. I'm the one whose life is falling apart. Eventually, he managed to pull himself together enough to talk. And that's when he told me everything. He admitted that he was gay, that he had been involved with Dylan for years, long before we ever met. But because he was an only child and his family was obsessed with tradition and carrying on the family name, he felt like he didn't have a choice. My parents would never accept it, he said, his voice trembling. They'd disown me. God, can you imagine what my dad would say? I couldn't do that to them. So instead, you did this to me? I shot back. You lied to me. You married me. You let me think we had a future together, and the whole time, you were my voice cracked, and I had to stop before I completely lost it. He started apologizing, saying things like, I never wanted to hurt you, and I thought I could make it work. And then came the part that really broke me. I thought if we had a child, it would fix everything, that it would make me feel more normal. Normal. He used the word normal, like I was some kind of band-aid for his identity crisis. I just stared at him, completely numb. So what? I said, finally, you got what you wanted? A wife, a kid, the perfect little facade for your family? And now what, Nate? Am I just supposed to play along? Pretend everything's fine? He dropped to his knees in front of me, grabbing my hands. Please, he begged. Please don't tell anyone. If my parents find out, it'll destroy them. I'll do anything. I'll give you whatever you want. Money, the house, anything. Just please don't say anything. I pulled my hands away. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about your parents. This is about me. My life. My future. Do you even care about that? He didn't answer. He just sat there on the floor, looking completely broken. And for the first time, I realized I didn't feel sorry for him. Not even a little. After Nate's confession, I felt like I was walking around in some kind of nightmare. Like this wasn't my real life. It couldn't be. I kept thinking about all the little moments over the years that suddenly made sense now. The distance, the excuses, the way he'd light up whenever Dylan was around. How did I not see it? How did I miss something so big? I felt stupid, humiliated, and angrier than I'd ever been in my life. But more than anything, I felt trapped. I was pregnant. I had a baby on the way, and the person I thought I'd be raising that baby with had just admitted that our entire marriage was basically a lie. What the hell was I supposed to do with that? I couldn't stay in the house that day. I grabbed my purse and my car keys and told Nate I needed space. He tried to stop me, saying we needed to talk more, but I just walked out the door. I didn't even know where I was going. I just drove. Eventually, I ended up at my best friend Claire's house. She's been my ride or die since college. The kind of friend who tells you the hard truths, but also lets you cry on her couch for as long as you need. As soon as I walked in and saw her face, I broke down. I told her everything about Dylan, about the messages, about Nate's confession. She sat there quietly, listening, her face going through about 100 different emotions as I talked. When I was done, she leaned back and let out this long sigh. Okay, she said. So, what are you going to do? That was the question, wasn't it? What was I going to do? For the rest of the day, we talked through every possible scenario. Staying, leaving, co-parenting, going nuclear, and telling his family everything. It all seemed like a mess, no matter how we sliced it. But by the time I left her house, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in a marriage that was built on lies. The next few weeks were a blur of awkward conversations with Nate, meetings with lawyers, and a lot of crying. Nate kept trying to convince me to stay, offering me everything from money to joint custody agreements to promises that he'd be better. But what did better even mean? He couldn't magically change who he was, and honestly, I didn't want him to. I didn't hate him for being gay. I hated him for lying to me, for using me to cover up his secret, for making me feel like I was the problem when all along, it was him. And then there was the baby. I know this part might be controversial, but I have to be honest about what I was feeling. I couldn't bring a child into this mess. I just couldn't. Every time I thought about raising a baby in a broken home, with a father who was only there out of obligation, I felt this pit in my stomach. Claire was the one who finally said it out loud. You don't have to keep the pregnancy if it doesn't feel right. She was right. It didn't feel right. I'd always imagined having a child with someone who loved me, someone who wanted to create a family with me, not someone who saw me as a means to an end. So I made the hardest decision of my life. I terminated the pregnancy. It wasn't easy, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It broke me. But it also felt like the only way to take back control of my life, to start over without being tied to a man who had betrayed me in the deepest way possible. Once that decision was made, everything else started falling into place. I filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Nate didn't fight me on it. He knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. He offered me a huge settlement, probably in an attempt to ease his guilt, but I turned it down. I didn't want his money. I just wanted out. I told him I'd keep the real reason for our divorce quiet, though not for his sake. I didn't care about protecting him. I just didn't want to deal with the drama of his family or the judgment of our mutual friends. As far as anyone else knew, we split because we weren't compatible. End of story. The day the divorce was finalized, I packed up my stuff and moved back to Wisconsin. My parents didn't ask too many questions, thank God. I think they could tell I wasn't ready to talk about it. I got a new job, a tiny apartment, and started rebuilding my life piece by piece. It was hard, but it was also freeing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells or trying to make someone else happy. I could just focus on me,